Hello friends. This is Phoenix What If. How are you all? So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto incarnated in Bleach World and fell in love with Yoruichi Shiwan? But before we start, if you want more amazing stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, if possible, share this video. Uzumaki Naruto was a simple boy. He liked ramen, enjoyed the odd prank, and would do anything to protect those precious to him. His precious people, as he called them, were what drove him, what gave him the will to live, the will to keep fighting for a better day. At least they were, because no amount of will, no amount of drive, seemed enough to bring him back to life. Standing in the middle of what used to be a lush green mountain valley, but was now a barren waste filled with smoldering craters and charred earth, Naruto stared at the lifeless corpse in front of him. His body numbed by shock and disbelief over the vision before him and the vivid memories of recent events, yet he was strangely at peace. He knew the truth of what was before him. The war had been won, and those that had survived would be free to live their lives in peace, so he wasn't as distraught as he thought he would be. The body in front of him was adorned in a red haori wreathed in black flames, the tattered orange and black jumpsuit being the most identifying article of clothing one would ever see on a shinobi. Well, other than the golden blonde hair, of course. There was a peaceful expression on its face, and a small serene smile on its lips, as if they had come to terms with their mortality and were content with all that they had accomplished. This was the body of Uzumaki Naruto. This was his body. Naruto looked down at his chest, where a small chain hung down to his knees from where it protruded from his sternum. He looked unhurt, the wounds present on the corpse, his corpse nowhere to be found on what he could only assume to be his soul. It was as if he hadn't just fought in a battle of epic proportions against a resurrected primordial god and the lunatic responsible for every moment of suffering he'd endured in his admittedly short life. When he looked back up and brushed a hand through his hair, he couldn't help but notice that every movement was sluggish. His body felt as if he was trying to move underwater, like he would normally feel if he was suffering from chakra exhaustion. Then again, he was dead, and even though he wasn't as smart as Sakura, Naruto was well aware of the fact that one needed to have a physical presence to wield chakra. He was a soul now, with no physical body with which to house and produce chakra. With another sigh, Naruto sat down in the dirt and crossed his legs beneath him in an attempt to meditate. He needed to stay calm. Freaking out would do him no favors, and it's not like it would change anything. The Shinigami himself would be coming for him soon. He could feel it in every fiber of his being. Where would he go? Would the Shinigami devour his soul like he had his father's? Would he go to the pure world? Or would he face a fate much like his father? There were so many questions that Naruto wanted answered, but alas, it was not to be. He could feel a presence behind him, powerful, yet serene. It was a nearly overwhelming feeling, yet he could also sense an underlying layer of mischief, playfulness. The feeling he was getting from this being behind him was strange. The Shinigami was supposed to be the embodiment of all the negative feelings the world had to offer, yet he sensed nothing malicious in the presence behind him at all. Only power. For the longest time, there was no sound, not the whisper of the breeze or even the sound of a breath. When no words were forthcoming, and the presence behind him remained completely still, Naruto sighed and opened his eyes. "You're late, Shinigami-sama. After all, I've been waiting for some time now, you know." There was no vocal reply, but the presence moved until it was right next to him. Looking out the corner of his eye, Naruto caught a flash of white cloth fluttering in the breeze, and shinobi-style tabi. Tabi. Turning his head to take in the appearance of the person next to him, Naruto was met by the grim visage of a dark-skinned woman with short purple hair, reminiscent of a late friend of his. Her narrow eyes directed her solemn golden gaze over the field as she stood next to the sitting shinobi. She was over a half a foot shorter than he was, he having hit a growth spurt during the war to stand at an imposing 5 foot 11 inches, while she stood at around 5 feet. Maybe a couple inches taller, 5 foot 2 maybe. Her height wasn't really an issue, however, but she definitely possessed a figure that even many kunoichi could only wish for. She was wearing a white long-sleeved haori over a black kimono, a white sash about her waist, and a black choker around her neck. A small wakizashi was strapped across her lower back, a hand gently resting upon the tsuka, ready to draw but still appearing non-threatening. She was very beautiful, Naruto thought idly, taking in her slender form and topaz-colored eyes for several long moments. Her form was toned, obviously having been trained for combat, but boasted an incredible bust that only a small number of kunoichi he'd known in his life could compare to. Her skin looked almost unnaturally smooth, colored like caramel. Her amber gaze was set in a solemn frown, the corners of her mouth turned downward as she surveyed the battlefield before them. The Jubi had long since dispersed, but the evidence of its involvement were plain to see. Overturned trees, burnt-out earth, craters large enough to fit entire villages several times over. His body wasn't the only one on the field either. As hard as he'd fought to minimize casualties, he and the rest of Team 7 were not all-powerful. Considering they were fighting against a primordial demon god of incomprehensible power, a deranged psychopath with far more power than any one human should ever possess, and the manifestation of the mother of all chakra, the rabbit goddess Kagaya Otsutsuki. It was a wonder any of them had survived really, but it didn't change the fact that so many had lost their lives for the ambition of what amounted to a senile old woman who had been trapped in the moon or over 1,000 years. When he was finished with his observation, he turned his head back to the field in front of him and chuckled dryly. This never should have happened, none of it, all these people never had to die. Yet we couldn't stop it in time, and so many people lost their lives to protect this world. I'm just relieved to know that it's over, and those that survived can live their lives with some semblance of peace now. That all our sacrifices won't be in vain. Still the woman said nothing, but her gaze had shifted until she was looking at him. So, he continued to talk, trying to comfort himself really as he realized all of the things he'd never accomplish, that some of his fondest dreams would never come true. It was all hitting him in a rush now. His dream of becoming Hokage was now out of reach. He had been named as Tsunade's successor and all but been given the hat, but it would never be. Most of all though, was his greatest wish. His wish of one day starting a family of his own, being able to witness his kids' first steps and hear their first words. Shion, among others, would be a mess when she found out he'd died, he realized sadly. He'd agreed to give her children not long before the war had really started to heat up, and their first try had been successful. They were going to have twins, but he wouldn't be there for them. All of this and more he spoke into the wind. The woman next to him simply listening, her expression stoic, but not unkind or cold. If he was feeling her right, she was simply trying to put up a strong front. She didn't want him to see what she was feeling, but didn't know that he could feel it. She was hiding a great deal of anguish, as if she were directly related to the events that had transpired here. Gomen. I shouldn't be rambling like this. Naruto sighed, something he seemed to be doing a lot since he died only a few short hours ago. Before you do whatever it is you're going to do to me, like send me to hell or whatever, can I ask you something? When the woman looked down at him and nodded, Naruto offered her a small smile in thanks. There was a man, wearing an orange spiral mask somewhere around here. Is he still here? The woman was silent for a moment, seeming almost remorseful, but the expression was fleeting. She slowly shook her head in the negative before speaking. No, his soul was already konzoed, and the gates of hell appeared to claim him. He's gone for good, so you have nothing to worry about. Naruto nodded. I see. He looked up at the woman, his expression one of solemn acceptance. It's too bad really. Obito had come around in the end. If not for him I don't think we would have won. Mind you, if it hadn't been for him, none of this would have happened in the first place. His gaze returned to the charred wasteland before him, resting on his own body for a moment, before a single brow rose in question as he realized something strange. Wait a second. Are you the Shinigami? You look nothing like that creepy thing I saw all those years ago. The woman nodded but said nothing further on the matter. With a feline grace she moved to stand in front of him, yet he didn't move, merely following her with his eyes. Turning to face him, the woman reached behind her and drew her sword, and in response Naruto smiled and closed his eyes, ready for the next stage of his journey at long last. I'm going to send you to Soul Society. I guess you would refer to it as the pure world. Naruto was rather confused though. Why would the Shinigami send him to heaven? And why would the Shinigami be a beautiful woman? Was it to make him more comfortable in its presence? Or had the Shinigami really been a she all this time? He didn't have much time to think on it though, as the next thing he knew the woman had tapped the pommel of her sword against his forehead and almost instantly a soft blue light appeared before his eyes. Looking down, he noticed a circle of light beneath him, his body beginning to sink into the earth as if he was being converted into light. When he looked back up he smiled a little bit wider than before, his first genuine smile in what felt to him like ages. My name is Namikaze Uzumaki Naruto, former shinobi of Konohagakure. What's yours, Shinigami-san? The woman smiled for the first time since he'd seen her as she sheathed her sword. She then placed a hand on her hip and swung her hips out to the side in a teasing manner. Quite the long name there, handsome, and it's Yoruichi. Shihouen Yoruichi, Niban Tai Taiko of the Gotaija Sentai. See you soon, Naruto-kun. When the light finally faded and everything had gone dark, only a single thing passed through his mind before even thought was lost to him. What a pretty name. Yoruichi's name in kanji translates to Shihouen, 4-tree Imperial Palace, and Yoruichi, one evening. Took me forever to work that out. Tell me if I'm wrong, though it still sounds nice. Scene break. When Shihouen Yoruichi returned to Squad 2's barracks, she immediately went to her room and tossed her haori on her desk before flopping down onto her futon face first. Her report to the Su Taiko had been long and emotionally trying, having to detail the events of a war between the forces of man and an endless army of what appeared to be white plants, the resurgence of a primordial god that even the Gotaija Sentai was wary of, its subsequent defeat at the hands of a young man no older than 17, and the death of said teen that Yoruichi had been watching over since his birth. It was the original deal between the Su Taiko and the man known as Namikaze Minato, to have someone competent keep their eyes on his son and make sure he didn't become a target for the more opportunistic hollows, or anything else of a more supernatural nature that would want to take advantage of such a powerful demon being sealed within a human child. Minato had long since reincarnated, as he was not allowed to enter the Seirei for another 600 years at the least if he was still eligible to do so when that time came. That's what happens when you summon a Shinigami to the land of the living after all. A price had to be paid to wield such an ability. She'd watched over young Naruto since he was only hours old, through all the good times and bad, his first steps, his first words, his first beating at the hands of a drunk, and the day he'd finally earned the respect of the village he'd sworn to protect, and over the years the little knucklehead had grown on her. To watch him die had nearly broken her, and to be completely honest, all she wanted to do right now was to curl up in her futon and cry. She knew he was here in the Soul Society, somewhere out in the Rukongai, but they might never find him before he re-entered the cycle of reincarnation. She might never see that little ball of sunshine ever again, and that tore her up inside. A knock on the door went unnoticed, and the following voice that announced the arrival of her protege, personal guard, and servant from the Fung clan along with it, before someone entered her room. Finally taking notice of the new arrival, Yoruichi reached a hand out towards the younger woman and waved her over. Come, Heir Sui Fung. The young woman timidly approached her mentor and idol before kneeling down next to the futon. She was about to ask what was bothering the older woman when the collar of her training clothes was snagged in Yoruichi's iron grip and Sui Fung was dragged into a rather tight embrace. Yoruichi-sama. What is? She trailed off when she realized something odd. Her mentor was doing something she'd never seen her do before. She was crying silently, holding onto Sui Fung like a child would a stuffed animal and burying her face into the younger woman's chest. Sui Fung, I'll answer your questions later. Just let me stay like this for a bit, alright? Sui Fung nodded dumbly and like that Yoruichi eventually drifted off to sleep. It had been a long day for her, and she'd been more tired than she'd thought. Sui Fung meanwhile just frowned in thought. Her mentor's current emotional state must have something to do with her last mission. Over the last 16 or so years Yoruichi had been disappearing rather often, stating that it was on orders from the Su Taiko and that she had things to check up on in District 13. Which was cause enough for concern in Sui Feng's opinion. District 13 was home to some of the most terrifying beings Sui Feng had ever heard of. Humans with supernatural powers that defied the laws of physics, and demons the size of small mountains with powers beyond even captain-class Shinigami. These humans had strength enough to shatter concrete with their bare hands and speed even greater than Yoruichi, the goddess of flash. In some cases, she had never quite known what business Yoruichi could have had in such a place, as hollows were far too wary of the place to set foot there to hunt for souls. It was a rather simple matter for the Shinigami of the Hachibantai to console the souls of those that died in that pocket dimension, since any hollows that did appear there were disposed of by the residents before long. So she opted to stop thinking too hard on it and just stroked Yoruichi's hair soothingly as the woman slept. Before long Yoruichi had woken up, and almost immediately set into her story. What she had been sent to do in District 13, and what she had witnessed over the past several months since she left for District 13, up until her return just that morning. Needless to say, Sui Feng was shocked, and after hearing about this young man whom Yoruichi had been looking after for so long, she too felt her mentor's pain and heartbreak. It would almost be like watching your own child die. So Sui Feng made her mentor a promise: she would search the Rukongai high and low whenever she had the chance. She would find this boy and bring him to the Seirei for her, and she would protect him with her life just as she would Yoruichi. Yoruichi was touched and proved it by drawing her protege into a warm embrace, whispering her thanks into the younger woman's ear and reveling in the bright blush the action brought to the young woman's face. When she released her, she held her at arm's length and smiled. "Thank you, Sui Feng, that means a lot to me. I'll be searching as well. A person who was as powerful as he was in life is bound to have staggering strength now that his soul is unbound from its physical shell. It would do the whole of Soul Society some good to see that he's properly trained." Sui Feng nodded before kneeling at the foot of Yoruichi's futon, her head bowed submissively. "I promise you again, Yoruichi-sama, I will find this boy, this I vow upon my very life." Scene break. When Naruto opened his eyes to the world, the first thing he had noticed was that his normal clothing was gone, replaced by a plain beige kimono with white underclothing and a pair of straw sandals. He had also been standing in some sort of room with plain white walls at the back of a long line of similarly dressed individuals. Now though, after traveling for the past 3 days, he had gone to sleep in the center of a large forest clearing at the edge of a wide lake. Birdsong filled the air, having been what woke him, and a soft breeze carried through and gently ruffled his hair like a doting father. Pushing himself into a sitting position, he looked out over the clearing and took in the sight of the large lake that dominated over half of the clearing, its crystal clear water affording him a view straight to the sandy lake bed and dozens of schools of fish. Surrounding this clearing was a dense corpse of trees and shrubs, and beyond that his sharp ears could just barely make out the sound of a large mass of people, likely the village he'd entered upon first arriving in Soul Society. Slowly dragging himself to his feet, Naruto moved into the shade of the trees before leaning against one and sliding back down to the grass. He was tired and hungry, but he'd felt worse. He just needed to rest a little bit more and make his way back into the town before dark. Thinking back on what had happened, Naruto rested his head on his knees and wrapped his arms around his legs. He'd died, and the Shinigami had performed a Kanso, as she'd called it, sending his soul to what she had called Soul Society. When he'd arrived, he'd been greeted by another person wearing similar clothing and handed a ticket of some sort. It had simply said W3. He'd been directed to what they had called West Rukongai District 3 or Hokkaido. When he'd arrived, he had opted to stay out of the village for the time being and made his way into the woods. Now here he was sitting about in some woodland area alone, his memories before that particular instance being a little foggy, something that caused him more than a little concern. He needed to come up with a plan of action. He may be dead, but he was still the same person he was before that. First he needed food, then he needed to find some proper attire. There was far too little orange in this kimono for his liking, and a haori like the one the toads made for him would be nice too. How he was going to get all of this he had no idea, but he would find a way. He was a shinobi after all. 6 months later, Rukongai, Hokkaido District. 6 months had seen Naruto employing all the tools of his former trade that he was able to. Since chakra was now beyond his reach as a spirit, he'd had to meditate for several long days before finally coming into contact with another energy source, an energy source that felt familiar yet completely different. When out amongst the town folk, he'd heard it referred to as Raryoku, and he'd immediately set about attempting to harness this energy. It had taken him several weeks before he'd managed to actually access this power and then train a sufficient level of control over what he'd learned to classify as an immense amount of this particular energy. Over the past 6 months he'd learned to reduce his Reiatsu, or the ambient Raryoku that flowed from a pair of vents on his wrists, to the point that he was nearly undetectable, as was the way of the shinobi to strike unseen. He'd used this ability along with others to acquire what he would need to survive, before he decided to build himself a house outside the village. That forest clearing sounded like a good place. And so, there went a good 4 months of his time in Hokkaido. Without the use of Kage Bunshin it had taken much longer than it normally would have, but he'd increased his muscle definition a great deal, thinking of it as training. He'd built himself a traditional-style manor house reminiscent of one he'd seen during his genin days that he'd taken a liking to. It was a single floor surrounded by high walls with a large yard for training. The main building was a good 60 meters long and 30 meters wide, containing several bedrooms and a small kitchen with a large sitting room dominating most of the interior. The sitting room opened out into the yard, with a long deck framing that entire side of the house beneath the roof awning. All in all,